It seems that at the very least that points were made as far as potentially being constructive here in regards to how this meeting went. But when you talk about what the United States is threatening sort of moving forward in regards to sanctions, do we have any sense as to whether those plans have slowed in any way, or the magnitude of what we were expecting to come?
It's a great question, and at this point, it appears that those plans remain in place. In essence, this meeting that the Russians requested with Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy for Russia and Ukraine, this meeting wasn't able to actually put anything on the table from the Russian side that would bring a swift end to this conflict. So while the Trump administration, President Trump himself, is saying that this was a highly productive meeting, they're simultaneously, according to a White House official, going to be moving forward with these sanctions, these secondary sanctions on those who import Russian oil coming later this week. And simultaneously, just hours after the meeting occurred, the White House also put out an executive order saying that there would be additional tariffs on India as a result of their imports of Russian oil. So you have a dynamic here where there are multiple levers that the administration is looking to use to clearly pressure Russia to try and actually end this conflict. Those are tools in their toolkit that the Trump administration was not willing to use or really even discuss for the first few months of their administration. So this is a very different strategy from the Trump administration. But what will be interesting and very important to watch here, Omar, is when the rubber hits the road. The Trump administration, a White House official saying that those secondary sanctions are going to go into effect on Friday. We'll have to watch and see if they actually do. And those tariffs on India as a result of India importing Russian oil are set to go into effect in 21 days from now. So that isn't immediate. It is an intention of the Trump administration to do it with this executive order, but we have to watch and see what actually happens. Also, what Europeans are saying about this, if they believe that there was any actual offers from Russia that could potentially lead to an end to this conflict, which they have been trying to do for years now.
And that dynamic of secondary sanctions or tariffs has been a threshold we've been watching to see breached for a while. We will see if these threats actually bear out. Kylie Atwood, appreciate it. I want to keep this conversation going with Stephen Pifer, a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He's an affiliate of the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, and wrote an article this week titled "Trump's New Deadline for Moscow, Does He Mean It This Time?" which I think is the right place to start this discussion. We've seen various threats from President Trump of sanctions, for example, within the context of ending the war in Ukraine. But do you think this moment is different for the U.S. president as opposed to what it was at this time last month or potentially even the month before?
Well, that really is the question. In April and May, I think Mr. Trump 3 times set deadlines for Russia to do something. Russia did nothing, and then there was no punitive step against Russia taken by Mr. Trump. So we'll see what happens on Friday. Now, he's talked about great progress. We don't yet know what Mr. Witkoff is bringing back from Moscow. But I would note that up until today, all the signals from the Kremlin were that 1, Russian war aims remain unchanged, and 2, that Russia fully intends to continue to prosecute this war. So it'll be interesting to see whether what Mr. Witkoff brings back, does that really justify not moving forward with a fairly significant set of sanctions on Friday?
Yeah, I mean, you wrote in your article that President Trump does still have significant potential leverage should he choose to use it here. What do you mean by that? What options do you think are still on the table right now?
Yeah, when you talk about secondary sanctions, he's talking about secondary sanctions on India, but not on China. And China by far is Russia's largest trading partner and imports much more energy from Russia than India does. But those are economic sanctions which can have an impact. But I think a more important impact on Moscow would be if Mr. Trump were to do things like ask Congress for more money so that we would be not just selling weapons to Ukraine, but actually providing the assistance and providing weapons to Ukraine, or perhaps in conjunction with that, working with the Europeans to go ahead and seize the $300 billion in Russian frozen central bank assets and put that money into a fund that Ukraine could use both for reconstruction and to buy weapons. Those kind of steps would confront Putin with the probability that Ukraine can fund its defense for years to come. And then Putin has to ask himself, does he really want to continue to absorb the kind of casualties? Bear in mind that Russia's lost more than 1 million soldiers now, killed and wounded in action. I think that might have a bigger impact than more economic sanctions.
And on the economic front, though, you know, as we talk about this threshold of secondary tariffs and sanctions on India, because of the amount of oil and gas they import from Russia, it was around 36% of their oil and gas was coming from Russia, according to at least one data firm here. But the threatened rate of 25% tariffs on top of the previously announced 25% tariff set to go into effect Thursday would bring the total tariff rate to 50% total with India. You know, you sort of start to go down this path where you could create some longstanding damage to what has been a longstanding trading relationship here. Do you think this is a smart path to go down in furtherance of potentially weakening Russia, but with a pitfall of also weakening a relationship with a consistent trade partner?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I think you have the conflict of two different objectives. I mean, I do agree that if you could find a way to lower the revenues that Russia receives from its oil exports, that would be a good thing. But I'm not sure that secondary sanctions like this are the best way to do it, as opposed to what the United States and the European Union have been talking about now for a couple of years, where they have set a price cap, saying that if you want to use Western flag tankers or have Western insurance for shipping oil, you can be moving oil that the Russians are selling only at $60 per barrel. That keeps the Russian oil on global markets, so it keeps the global price down, but it reduces the amount of money that the Kremlin gets for that. And then you do that and then sanction these shadow fleet tankers that Russia is using so that countries will refuse to use them. That's how you can put pressure on Russia. And I think that may be a more effective way than some of these secondary sanctions, which then will conflict with our goals dealing with third countries.
Yeah. And, you know, you mentioned China earlier, also imports a lot of energy from Russia. The U.S. already waging their own tariff war, truce, threats, back and forth, cycling between those three stages at various points. But I wonder how you see the dynamic with China differing from the dynamic with India in regards to, again, whether it's secondary sanctions or another remedy that the United States chooses to move forward on.
Well, I think the challenge with China is that China has some counter leverage vis-a-vis the United States, in that at this point in time, unfortunately, we still remain overly dependent on China for things like rare earth minerals that are important to high-tech products in the United States. And that may be one reason why the Trump administration and the White House are talking about secondary sanctions against India, but thus far they've not talked about those kind of sanctions against China, even though China imports far more energy from Russia than India does, and China is by far Russia's largest trading partner.
Yeah, and just looking at some of the numbers from last year, the share of U.S. imports, China made up closer to 15% of those imports, so clearly making up a large portion of what the U.S. is bringing in so far.